across the breadth of America. But it is not by his words that this man wishes to be judged, but by what he has done. This is a man of deeds more than rhetoric, a man of vision born out of his own trials, his own succeeding. This is a man who calls out to America to have faith in itself, to go forward without fear, to build on the foundations he has laid down, and America will hear him.
Road to the White House Rewind brings you archival coverage of presidential races. Coming up next, we'll show you a program produced for the 1972 campaign of Democratic nominee and South Dakota Senator George McGovern. Aired on national television on the eve of the general election. This half-hour program starts with remarks by former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and it includes a documentary on Senator McGovern's early life, his time in Congress, and his quest for the presidency. George McGovern lost the 1972 general election to incumbent President Richard Nixon, with Mr. Nixon winning the popular vote 61 to 38%.
This is Senator Hubert Humphrey. Since 1945, when I was elected mayor of my city of Minneapolis, I've worked to serve my party and my country. As mayor, as a United States senator, as vice president, and as a presidential candidate. I have felt a deep identity with the people of this country, and I've always held to my firm belief that the Democratic Party was the party that could best serve the people. Now, perhaps you voted for Mr. Nixon in 1968. Looking back, would you have voted for him had you known that inflation and unemployment would both get worse? That you would be forgotten while Mr. Nixon conducted his government of, by, and for the big corporations, the big money, and the Republican campaign contributors? Or that there was no real secret plan for peace? Mr. Nixon and the Republican Party believe they will have another 4 years in office. Mr. Nixon has not campaigned, but has stayed inside the White House while public relations men and his $40 million campaign fund do his work for him again. As in 1968, he refuses to debate his opponent. Mr. Nixon wants to be reelected without ever facing either George McGovern or the American people. Mr. Nixon is taking the American people for granted. That is unforgivable. Now, I've known George and Eleanor McGovern for many years. When George McGovern first came to the Congress, well, they moved next door to Muriel and me in Washington. Our children have grown up together. I've known Sarge and Eunice Shriver since the days we worked with President Kennedy to create the Peace Corps, and since we worked with President Johnson to win the war on poverty. I know them, and I trust them. George McGovern and Sergeant Shriver are not computers. Like you and me, they're human beings with strengths and weaknesses. They've never pretended to be anything else. They've crossed this country from dawn to dark for many weeks, offering themselves to you, asking your help, telling you about their hopes and their plans for our country. The public opinion polls say they're far behind, just as the polls told John Kennedy that he was behind, just as they told Harry Truman he was behind, and just as they told me 4 years ago that I was behind. But they have never stopped, these men, McGovern and Shriver, fighting in their campaign. Now think for a minute about our country. What is it that you believe in? Do you believe, as Mr. Nixon and his party seem to, that the people are tired? They're no longer interested and they no longer care? Do you believe that after 4 years of broken promises, a man should be reelected president without even campaigning among the people? I ask you now, if you work for a living, work with your hands or in an office, if you believe everyone who wants to work should have a job, if you want a tax system that's fair to you, if you want a better home for your family, a better school for your children, if you believe all people were created equal and deserve the same equal chance, if you still feel as I do that we can live together as one people, join me at the voting booth on Tuesday. In 1960, John Kennedy won the presidency by a handful of votes over Richard Nixon. In 1968, I lost the presidency by a handful of votes to Mr. Nixon. Only a few votes made the difference. Only a few people who stayed at home or didn't stay at home. Next Tuesday, it will be time to vote again. I don't have to tell you the difference it will make. Think of the long journey we've made together. Think of your hopes, not your fears. Vote for what you know is right. Vote for George McGovern and Sergeant Shriver. Come home to the Democratic Party now.
It had been an unpredictable year, a year of floods and drought. But on the prairie, the harvest had been good. And as the seasons changed, for a moment the troubled air of the cities was clear. For some it was a time of their labor's end, but for others it was just beginning. He had campaigned longer than anyone in the history of our republic, and though his victories were many, the end seemed as far away as ever. But in the fall of '72, things were different, for he spoke now for more than just himself.
Pennsylvania votes 2 for Wallace.
As the final moment neared, some who had failed to understand before saw the promise of which he spoke.
81 for Senator McGovern.
That puts him very close. Here it comes.
The great state of Illinois.
The people in that hall, one reporter said, were as different as America is different. But they all were Democrats, and they all believed that this year they would make a difference. And they did.
For Senator McCarthy, and 119 votes.
It was almost dawn when he finally spoke, and the experts said no politician would have planned it this way. But this was not a convention that politicians had planned.
Join with me in this campaign, and together we will call America home to the ideals that nourished us from the very beginning. Come home to the affirmation that we have a dream. Come home to the conviction that we can move our country forward. Come home to the belief that we can seek a newer world. So let us close on this note. May God grant each one of us the wisdom to cherish this good land and to meet the great challenge that beckons us home. And now is the time to meet that challenge. Good night, and Godspeed to you all.
If there was joy in their parting, it was not to last, for unexpected events were soon to intervene. And perhaps now, more than ever, those who did not know him had a right to ask, who was he, and from where had he come? He was christened George Stanley McGovern, birthplace Avon, South Dakota. He grew up in Mitchell, started school there. But the more important lessons were learned at home. From his mother, a gentle spirit, and from his father, Christian principles and hard work. His father had spent his boyhood in the Illinois coal country, where the 14-hour days were measured out at 10 cents a bucket. But he found time to read scriptures and decided to abandon the mine for the pulpit. In 1899, he was ordained a minister. He chose to serve those who were immigrating to America to seek a better life. He followed them west, and while they fashioned a new existence from the prairie, he began building churches. McGovern built his last church in Mitchell when George was 5. As a boy, George had his father's love of history, but he would not be spared the troubles of his own time. The memory of seeing strong men weep, of what they'd suffered, would remain with him all his life. And he talked about it often to his old friend, historian Leonard Jenowan.
I can remember him talking about the hardships of the children in the community in which he lived as a boy, and how it seemed that people were fine people and yet were so oppressed economically. I think this struck him personally. Things shouldn't be the way they are. People should be able to live better than they were living. I remember these conversations. There is a closeness, perhaps, to the soil. If you are close to the soil, if you're close to the rivers and the rocks and the mountains and the peaks, if you have worked with your hands with the people who have gone through the problems that the people went through in the Middle Border, if you are at all a sensitive person, and George is a sensitive person, then you develop a feeling for this heritage, and I think this impels you. This somewhat motivates you.
At Mitchell High, George was a good student and a top debater. It was a time for searching conversation and a few youthful attractions, like the Stegerberg twins from Woonsocket, Isla and Eleanor. It was Eleanor he decided to marry, but the year was 1941. He chose to serve in the air, spent 15 months earning his wings, and went back to marry the girl from Woonsocket. A brief leave served for a honeymoon, and they said goodbye in Topeka, Kansas, and he went off to war. His unit was the 445th Bomb Group, 15th Air Force, flying B-24s out of Foggia, Italy. Their targets were the oil refineries and munition plants of Nazi Germany. But the cost was high. Only half his comrades were to survive. But those who did would remember how it was. Men like waist gunner Bill McAfee.
We just dropped our bombs over Brux, Germany. Number 2 engine was hit, and then we had trouble with number 3. We had a fire in number 3 engine. We had to try and feather the prop, but it wouldn't feather. At this time, we were over the Adriatic, and we were prepared to ditch. And then the navigator spotted a fighter landing strip in Yugoslavia, but it was awfully short. But rather than take a chance on ditching, George chose to go in there anyway for the safety of the crew. As far as we were concerned, the crew, there was no one better than George McGovern.
He finished his tour outwardly unscathed, but his pride in receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross was tempered by the haunting knowledge of its human cost. In 1945, his military service would come to an end. Having seen the destruction of war, he chose to build his future on the acts of peace. He began, like his father, in the pulpit. But his old love of history exerted a stronger pull, and he returned to the classroom. Eleanor, of course, went along, and by now there were a couple of new mouths to feed. The rooming house they lived in still stands, 710 Crock Street in Evanston. One of George's friends recalled later that on the GI Bill, on $30 a week, they all had to skimp and save pennies. It was not, Eleanor said, an ideal place for raising 2 small children. But we were young, and our friends all shared the same low budgets and high hopes. George had begun his studies with an eye to teaching, but his interest in politics was beginning to come to the front. His studies brought him a deepening sense of history and the legacy men of principle had left. Fellow student Bill Towner recalls the McGovern of that time.
I think that the series of decisions he made after getting out of World War II and being sickened by the bombing and the slaughter were all linked to his desire to provide the kind of leadership which he recognized had to be a kind of moral leadership. I think it gave him a purpose, a direction, and led him first of all into the ministry, secondly into history, and thirdly into politics.
His journey into politics began with what many said was an impossible task. For he set out alone to build a Democratic Party in the most Republican state in the Union. Week after week he traveled his state in a borrowed Chevrolet, sometimes driving 100 miles to convince one person that his was the party of change. And though his critics said he was headed nowhere, by 1956 he had a different destination in mind. He became the first Democratic congressman from his state in 20 years. And he went to work in a way that won him respect in Washington and re-election at home. Then in 1961, he was called to serve at the side of a new president with a new idea: food for peace. Hunger is the companion of communism, said George McGovern. So he organized Food for Peace as a war against hunger. He saw America's agricultural abundance was freedom's first line of defense. For 18 months, their fight for life was his fight, and his victories, even his small ones, were full of satisfaction. By 1962, he could report to the president that the real power of America was her productivity and its ability to bring hope and an end to suffering abroad. He invited the young president from Massachusetts to come home with him, to see the promise for himself.
Governor Guy, recently my associate at the White House, George McGovern, ladies and gentlemen. These dams, these great projects, frequently are statistics to those of us who work in the nation's capital. And I must say that I am heartened to come out here and talk to the distinguished engineer in charge and be informed by him that this has cost $25 million less than was estimated 8 years ago, and that stands as some kind of a record in the United States today. We're going to take him back to Washington and put him in charge of the whole operation. By the end of this century, we're going to have 300 million people and a $2 trillion national income, and a great responsibility as the food basket of a world which will double its population in the next 40 years. Let us develop the resources of our land, build up all its great institutions, and see whether we, in our time and generation, may not perform something worthy to be remembered.
In 1962, he came to the Senate, his own man. A senator, he said, should always follow the dictates of his conscience, regardless of the popularity of his stand. His manner won him the respect of his colleagues, both of another generation and another party. His quiet and reasoned voice came to be valued by those in power.
The first unit of the Hawaii irrigation project.
His colleagues came to know what his constituents already knew, that he was a man of principle, whose word and judgment could be trusted. Of all the men in the United States Senate, said Robert Kennedy, George McGovern does things in the most decent way.
We have the favorable report.
They were good times, Eleanor would remember. The children were old enough to share the excitement of our life. We were happy and together. But the quiet they knew now was not to last. For events in another place were preparing to intervene. 10 years ago, he would write, "We are making a mistake, the most tragic diplomatic and moral mistake of our history." The year was 1963. Having known combat himself, he saw this conflict was different. "I have never regretted," he said, "my service as a bomber pilot in World War II. But I do not believe that Vietnam is that kind of testing ground of freedom. I cannot remain silent in the face of what I regard as a policy of madness." Though his words were heard, they were not heeded. But the courage of his stand won him the respect of many, including those in the Senate who opposed him.
There's nobody in the Senate that had matched George McGovern's high level of dialogue on the Vietnam question. When George first came out on this, it was far from the popular side. He had to decide where he was going to stand. He took that stand and took it with great courage, and this is the thing you respect. It was obvious conviction and belief, and even at the expense of whatever it might do to him at home. And I think this is a measure of great public character, and he certainly has it.
What do you eat? What do you eat? I mean, what are the meals that you eat?
The acts of conscience that had earned the respect of his opponents brought a closeness and a commitment from those who shared his cause.
My testimony will focus on
Politics is the greatest of adventure. He has made it such, and also given it the highest standard. And therefore, it's the kind of person. There are Republicans and there are Democrats who are those kind of people. But George McGovern happens to be the kind of person that those of us who are colleagues of his in the United States Senate can be proud. And the United States of America can be proud that he's in public life.
But their dream was not to be, not in 1968. He would have to walk their path alone. Everywhere he traveled, he saw people felt their government no longer cared, even to end the hunger of a child. Nowhere did this official inhumanity cost our country and our people more. And he spoke out against the misordered priorities that squandered our taxes and destroyed so many of our children. For every dollar we fail to spend wisely now, he said, we will spend 4 times that amount on our prisons and welfare rolls. He saw other wounds in the country, and they disturbed him as deeply, for they were, in their own way, equally unfair.
Well, I just lost my husband, and we had a terrific income, but it all went taking care of him now, and I'm really down to nothing.
And I can't go to school for the rest of my life, and my folks aren't going to support me for the rest of my life. I mean, there ain't no jobs open.
The greater imperative is to get the drugs out of the neighborhoods.
This gets down to our crime rate, and the guy who's given up trying to make a buck and goes out and holds somebody up, he gets put in jail. We support him.
He died. They found him in his room. This is American veteran.
I got to pay 20% of what I earn in taxes, whereas some of the major industries in the country only got to pay under 10%.
Your lunch has been added on this, 5 cents on that. Before you know you've paid more, you may as well pay the money for the meat.
They make more profits working me 11 hours or 12 hours a day than they do working 3 shifts, 8 hours a day, because they don't have to pay any kind of human benefit.
The farmer is not getting out of his product what he should have. I think it's a crime.
The farmer's getting squeezed off.
I'm not one of these feminists that go around shouting all this stuff. I just want what's fair for us.
There should be something done so each individual would benefit from the life he spends on this earth. Just to work in a plant all those years to get your pension benefits, and then that's the end of your life. It just seems so ridiculous and unrewarding is really the word for it, unrewarding.
I love the United States, but I love it enough so I want to see some changes made. The American people want to believe in their government. want to believe in their country. And I'd like to be one of those that provides the kind of leadership that would help restore that kind of faith. I don't say I can do it alone. Of course I can. But the president can help set a new tone in this country. He can help raise the vision and the faith and the hope of the American people. And that's what I'd like to try to do.
I'd like to get a president that we can believe in.
I now seek the presidency as a public servant whose career has been...
His announcement, a year before everyone else, was not, in the words of one reporter, a prospect that brought fear to the hearts of the opposition. But perhaps what George McGovern was saying that day was heard more clearly in other rooms, in other places. They were, in the most part, unpaid volunteers, determined in 1972 to make the process work. In a time when elections depended on the secret contributions of a few, his campaign would be financed in a different way.
We don't have special interests contributing to the McGovern campaign. The money has come in contributions of $5, $10, $15. One man wrote a letter and said, we'll eat bologna and hot dogs for a while in order to contribute another $5 a month to the campaign. Now, that kind of support makes a candidate feel that he has a real obligation to the people.
50 up another, we sent 100 more.
He often walked the campaign trail alone, little known by the voters, and often ignored by the press. Slowly, even the national press sensed that something was happening, something new in American politics. They began to listen to this man. He was on the move. Within 2 months, he had eliminated the front runner, and the power brokers began to see that the people were not to be denied. Not this time. Everywhere he campaigned, the victories he had sought so long began to appear. And the joy and the gathering momentum of his success he would share with Eleanor. The triumph that surrounded him now was hers as well, for they had made this journey of 30 years together. And perhaps he would find, in the memory of their path, a way out of the wilderness for us all.
If you grow up out in the Great Plains, you have to live with the philosophy that next year is going to be better. You can't survive any other way. And maybe that's the way it is with life. You have to be an optimist to really get the most out of life. And people laugh about that relationship between a person and the land. They say it's an old-fashioned idea. It's really not, because first of all, it gives you a sense of knowing where you're from. If you don't have some frame of reference that's familiar and acceptable to you, it's hard to go into a complicated area like one of the great cities of this country and know what needs to be done. What needs to be done is to deal with the simple, ordinary problems of people, the houses they live in, the kind of health care they get, the neighborhoods they live in, so that you really build, again, a sense of caring about each other. That's what's important.
This country was conceived by men who had a dream of human dignity and justice and concern for each other. And if we begin now to match our policies with our ideals, then I believe it is yet possible that we will come to admire this country not simply because we were born here, but because of the kind of great and good land that you and I want it to be, and that together we have made it. That is my hope. That is my reason for seeking the presidency of the United States.